On June 5th, 1968, presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy was mortally wounded shortly after midnight at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Earlier that evening, the 42-year-old junior senator from New York was declared the winner in the South Dakota and California Democratic presidential primary during the 1968 presidential election. He was pronounced dead at 1:44 a.m. on June 6, about 26 hours after he had been shot. Following the dual victories in California and South Dakota primary elections for the Democratic nomination, the presidential nomination, Kennedy spoke to journalists and campaign workers at a live televised celebration from the stage of his headquarters at the Ambassador Hotel. Shortly after leaving the podium and exiting through the kitchen hallway, he was mortally wounded by multiple shots fired from a handgun. Kennedy died in the Good Samaritan Hospital 26 hours later. The shooter was 24-year-old Sirhan Sirhan. In 1969, Sirhan was convicted of murdering Kennedy and was sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1972 due to the court case People v. Anderson. A freelance newspaper reporter recorded the shooting on audio tape, and the aftermath was captured on film. Kennedy's remains were taken to St. Patrick's Cathedral, New York, for 2 days of the public viewing before a funeral mass was held on June 8th. His funeral train traveled from New York to Washington, D.C. Many spectators lined the route to view the journey. His body was interred at night in the Arlington National Cemetery near his brother, John F. Kennedy. His death was prompted by the United States Secret Service to protect presidential candidates. Vice President Hubert Humphrey was also a presidential candidate. He went on to win the Democratic nomination, but ultimately lost the election to the Republican candidate Richard Nixon. Much like his brother's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination has led to a number of conspiracy theories. To date, no credible evidence has emerged that Sirhan was not the shooter or that he did not act alone. Kennedy and Huey Long of Louisiana in 1935 are the only two sitting United States senators to be assassinated. It was one of the four major assassinations of the 1960s in the United States, coming several years after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, and 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968. Sirhan Sirhan, man who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy, granted parole. The man who killed Robert F. Kennedy was granted parole on Friday after two of the former attorney generals, senator and presidential hopeful's son, spoke in favor of the release, and prosecutors declined to argue he should be kept behind bars. The decision was a major victory for Sirhan Sirhan, 77, though it did not assure his release. The ruling by two-person panel at Sirhan's 16th parole hearing will be reviewed over 90 days by the California Parole Board. Then it will be sent to the governor, who will have 30 days to decide whether to grant it, reverse it, or modify it. Douglas Kennedy, a toddler when his father was killed in 1968, said he was moved to tears by Sirhan's remorse and said he should be released if he's not a threat to others. I'm overwhelmed just by being able to view Mr. Sirhan face to face, he said. I think I've lived my life both in fear of him and his name is one way or another. I think I lived my life both in fear of him and his name in one way or the other. And I am grateful today to see him as a human being worthy of compassion and love. Robert Kennedy, a New York senator and brother of President John F. Kennedy, was a Democratic presidential candidate when he was killed on 6 June 1968 at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, moments after delivering a victory speech in the pivotal California primary. Sirhan, convicted of first-degree murder, said he doesn't remember the killing. Angela Berry argued that the board should base its decision on who Sirhan is today. Prosecutors declined to participate or oppose his release under a policy by the Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon, a former police officer who took office last year, Gascon, who said he idolized the Kennedys and mourned RFK's assassination, believes the prosecutors' roles and at the sentencing, and they should not influence decisions to release the prisoners. As Douglas Kennedy spoke, Sirhan, in blue prison uniform with a paper towel folded like a handkerchief and tucked in his pocket, smiled as Kennedy spoke. Sirhan said he had learned to control his anger and was committed to living peacefully. Quote, "I would never put myself in jeopardy again," unquote. He said, quote, "You have my pledge, and I will always look to safety and peace and nonviolence," unquote. Some of Kennedy family members, Los Angeles law enforcement officers, and the public submitted letters opposing Sirhan's release. Parole Board Commissioner Robert Barton said at the start of the proceeding, which was held virtually, "We don't have a DA here, but I have to consider all sides," Barton said. Sirhan, a Christian Palestinian from Jordan, has served 53 years. He has acknowledged he was angry at Kennedy for his support of Israel. When asked how he feels about the Middle East conflict today, Sirhan broke down crying and temporarily couldn't speak. Quote, "Take a few deep breaths," unquote, said Barton, who noted the conflict had not gone away and still touch a nerve. Sirhan said he doesn't follow what's going on in the region, but thinks about the suffering of refugees. Quote, "The misery that those people are experiencing, it's painful," quote, Sirhan said. If released, Sirhan could be deported to Jordan. Barton said he was concerned he might become a, quote, "symbol or lightning rod to foment more violence," unquote. Sirhan said he's too old to be involved in the Middle East conflict and would detach himself from it. Quote, "The same argument can be said or made that I can be a peacemaker and a contributor to a friendly, nonviolent way of resolving the issues," unquote, Sirhan said. Paul Schrott, who was wounded in the shooting, also spoke in favor of his release. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who spoke in favor of Sirhan's release in the past, wrote in favor of parole. Sirhan was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life when the California Supreme Court briefly outlawed capital punishment in 1972. At his last parole hearing in 2016, commissioners concluded after more than 3 hours of intense testimony that Sirhan did not show adequate remorse or understand the enormity of his crime. Sirhan has stuck to his account that he doesn't remember the killing. California governor denies RFK's assassin Sirhan Sirhan parole. California's governor on Thursday rejected releasing Robert F. Kennedy's assassin Sirhan Sirhan from prison more than a half century after the 1968 slaying that the governor called one of America's most notorious crimes. Governor Gavin Newsom, who has cited RFK as his political hero, rejected a recommendation from a 2-person panel of parole commissioners. Newsom said Sirhan, even at age 77, poses an unreasonable threat to public safety. Mr. Sirhan's assassination of Senator Kennedy is among the most notorious crimes in American history. Governor Gavin Newsom, who has cited RFK as his political hero, rejected a recommendation from a 2-person panel of parole commissioners. Newsom says Sirhan, even at age 77, poses an unreasonable threat to public safety. Mr. Sirhan's assassination of Senator Kennedy is among the most notorious crimes in American history, Newsom wrote in his decision. Aside from causing Kennedy's then pregnant wife and 10 children immeasurable suffering, Newsom said the slaying also caused great harm to the American people. It upended the 1968 presidential election, leaving millions in the United States and beyond mourning the promise of his candidacy. Newsom wrote, Mr. Sirhan killed Senator Kennedy during a dark season of political assassinations, just 9 weeks after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s murder and 4.5 years after the murder of Senator Kennedy's brother, President John F. Kennedy. He said Sirhan still lacks insight, refused to accept responsibility, and has failed to disclaim violence committed in his name. These gaps in Mr. Sirhan's insight have a close nexus to his current risk of inciting further political violence, Newsom wrote. Robert Kennedy, the U.S. Senator from New York, was shot moments after he claimed victory in California's pivotal Democratic presidential primary. 5 others were wounded during the assassination at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Sirhan will ask a judge to overturn Newsom's denial, said his defense attorney, Angela Berry. We fully expect the judicial review of the governor's decision will show that the governor got it wrong, she said. State law upholds that inmates are supposed to be paroled unless they pose a current unreasonable public safety risk, she said, adding that not an iota of evidence exists to suggest that Mr. Sirhan is still a danger to society. She said the parole process has become politicized and Newsom chose to overrule his own experts on the parole board, ignoring the law. Newsom, a Democrat, is seeking re-election this year after handily defeating an effort last year to recall him in the midterm. Parole commissioners found Sirhan suitable for release because of the impressive, extensive record of rehabilitation over the last century. Berry said, since the mid-1980s, Mr. Sirhan has constantly been found by the prison psychologists and psychiatrists to not pose an unreasonable risk of danger to the public. During his parole, the white-haired Sirhan called Kennedy the hope of the world, but he stopped short of taking full responsibility for the shooting. He said he doesn't recall because he was drunk. It pains me, the knowledge for such a horrible deed, if I did in fact do that, Sirhan said. Kennedy's widow, Ethel, and 6 of his children hailed Newsom's decision in a statement that called RFK a visionary and champion of justice whose life was cut short by an enraged man with a small gun. The political passions that motivated this inmate's act still simmer today, and his refusal to admit the truth makes it impossible to conclude that he has overcome the evil that boiled over 53 years ago, they wrote. The parole panel recommendation in August to release Sirhan divided the iconic Kennedy family, with 2 RFK sons, Douglas Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, supporting his release. The panel's decision was based in part on several new California laws since he was denied parole in 2016, the 15th time he had lost his bid for release. Commissioners were required to consider that Sirhan committed his crime at a young age, when he was 24, that he now is elderly, and that the Christian Palestinian who immigrated from the Jordan has suffered childhood trauma from the conflict in the Middle East. In addition, Los Angeles County prosecutors didn't object to his parole, following District Attorney George Gascon's policy that prosecutors should not be involved in deciding whether or not the prisoners are ready for release. The decision had a personal element for Newsom, a fellow Democrat who displays RFK's folders in his official and home offices. One of them is of Kennedy with Newsom's late father.